This is the second of a series of videos discussing Chapter 9, the Central Nervous System. This video will be shorter than the previous video, as we're just going to briefly talk about some internal structures of the brain. Many of these structures were already addressed in the Central Nervous System lab, so some of them should be a bit of a review, or at least slightly familiar to you. So to recall, in the previous video we looked at the outer cerebral cortex, which in this image is highlighted in the blue. We're now going to move into the internal structures that are highlighted in the yellow, and the orange, and the pink, green, and the purple structures. The first structure that we're going to talk about is a group of cells which collectively make up an area which are called the basal nuclei. You have a similar image in your textbook as titled Figure 8-12. And the basal nuclei in this image are highlighted in the kind of fuchsia pink structures. Okay, so it's a bunch of cells working together. And their roles aren't necessarily completely understood, but the cells in the basal nuclei are known to have a role in physical motor control, working with the frontal lobe. And if we look at what they do, is they actually inhibit muscle tone and prevent muscle contraction through the body. And at face value, that seems weird to inhibit muscle tone, unless you think of all the muscles that you have in your body. You don't need all the muscles in your body contracting all the time, and so we have to have an inhibitory effect on them. And so the cells of the basal nuclei help regulate that, as well as when you do some planned movement, the basal nuclei will make sure that those muscles that need to relax are relaxing, so you're not having a strange, weird, jerky type of movement. Just trying to, say, for example, walk across the room. Your movement can be really fluid due to this inhibitory role that the cells in the basal nuclei carry out. Alright, so it gives you, as illustrated, voluntary control over your slow, regulated muscle contractions. So that's the cells in the basal nuclei. They're in the internal core of the brain, and you can see illustrated in this image here on the bottom that the cells of the basal nuclei, highlight this, are in this gray matter area of the brain. Within the brain, there's an area called the diencephalon, so it's the kind of inside of the brain, and it's described here, the central core of the forebrain. And there's three major regions. This is not everything that make up the diencephalon, but there are three major regions of the diencephalon, including two areas that we've actually found in lab. We actually looked at the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Didn't make any mention of the epithalamus, though, so let's kind of briefly talk about it. If we look at this image, the area that we're talking about include where I'm going to highlight epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. So in other words, we're kind of in this core area of the brain making up the diencephalon. Looking at the role of the thalamus, if you recall from lab, this is described as a relay center, in that all of our sensory input, I have all senses, but you may recall from lab that everything except for a sense of smell, afferent nerves will actually synapse here, and the inner neurons of the thalamus will make decisions, if you will, and activate the correct lobe of the brain. And some examples we gave in class are, for example, like optic nerve would synapse here, and the thalamus would then activate cells in the occipital lobe. Conversely, physical, touch at your fingertips, nerves would synapse to the thalamus. The thalamus would then activate areas of the parietal lobe, because that gives us our somatosensory ability. So what it does is not only relay, but it actually sorts similar bits of information, and then sends everything, kind of packages everything as a group bit of information. That's a primary role of the thalamus, but it's by all means not everything that it does. Below it is the hypothalamus, and mentioned in lab as well. The hypothalamus is often referred to as the most important structure for homeostasis, because it compares set point for almost everything that we do. Not only temperature and water balance, whatever, emotional responses and such are also regulated here through the hypothalamus. Okay. In class, we'll talk about the hypothalamus for the rest of the semester. It's regulation of blood pressure, heart rate. We won't really talk about it in the digestive system, but we'll certainly again talk about it in the respiratory system at the end of the semester. And temperature we've talked about, certainly regulated by the hypothalamus. Other things that the hypothalamus regulates, as I mentioned, emotional responses like pleasure, fear, sleep, your thirst mechanism, and we'll certainly cover it in the endocrine system coming up in Unit 3 in the role of production of two neurohormones called antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and a whole bunch of other ones that actually regulate the anterior pituitary. So soon you'll get to become really familiar with the hypothalamus. And certainly it does regulate the sympathetic and parasympathetic effect on things like previously listed, the heart, the respiratory system, digestive system, etc. The epithalamus actually sits atop the thalamus, and extending from it on the posterior end of the epithalamus is a structure called the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is a structure which releases a hormone called melatonin, and you may be familiar with this one. This is the described as this like sleep hormone. This is the one that surges at night when you get ready to, when you're starting to feel sleepy and slow down. Right? Melatonin from the pineal gland is producing that. And I know at least, I think both labs that we did last week actually showed you guys where the pineal gland is in the little sheep brains. Also in the epithalamus is a set of specialized blood vessels called the choroid plexus. This isn't the only place where you'll find these capillaries, but this is one place where you'll find them, in the epithalamus. And this helps form your cerebral spinal fluid. In addition to some of those internal structures, another part of the central nervous system that's important to talk about is called the brainstem. And we also briefly looked at some of these structures in lab. The three primary areas which make up the brainstem include what's called the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And it regulates what's described as survival type of behavior. So you're looking at your heart rate and your respiratory rate, for example. And as well as just a physical passageway for nerve cells to connect between the upper cerebrum and the spinal cord. So it's just, if we go back to the highway analogies, which I've used in class before, it's just a kind of a crossroads, if you will. But it also has important survival type roles. You may recall from lab as well that 10 of your 12 cranial nerves branch off of the brainstem. Okay, so I've got a question for you. Coming straight from lab, which two cranial nerves do not branch off of the brainstem? You should recall that cranial nerves 1 and 2 do not branch off of the brainstem. That's your olfactory nerve and your optic nerve. Everything else, 3 through 12, branch off of the brainstem. This image is looking at, this is the frontal or anterior view of the brainstem. The thalamus is highlighted in blue. If you look in the red structures, I'm going to try to draw a little highlight on the top and in the middle. Those are examples of the specialized capillaries or the choroid plexi that help form the cerebral spinal fluid. The brainstem itself is the green structure. So I'm going to highlight here. The entire green structure itself is the brainstem. But notice, it probably would have been better if I'd excluded the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are actually part of the peripheral nervous system. So this structure is the green thing is the brainstem. The area kind of here and up is called the midbrain. The pons is what I describe as kind of like the swollen area of the brainstem, and the remainder of the brainstem is called the medulla. And you properly call it the medulla oblongata. Alright, so if we look at the midbrain, it's just between the area that we just discussed, the diencephalon, so below the hypothalamus, yet above the pons. So it's in the middle, and it's appropriately named. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 are regulated here through the brainstem, your ocular motor and your trochlear nerve, and appropriately is going to allow for the pathway for your visual reflexes, and then also your auditory nerves will pass through here as well. Traveling through the midbrain are a set of cells that make up this thing called the reticular formation. I'm just going to call it that for right now, and I'll come back to describing what the reticular formation is in just a moment. So below the midbrain is an area of the brainstem called the pons. Right, so it's described here. So it's below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata, and it's that kind of bulgy portion. This image on the bottom left is a cross section of the pons, so you're looking kind of down on the pons. And you can see both the left and the right hand side. And we see portion of our trigeminal nerve, the yellow structure, kind of projecting out of here. Okay, so we've got a little cranial nerve. You can kind of get an idea how it originates or begins in here. And then if we look at some cells in the pons, it does serve as a kind of relay center like before. But if you notice where it's located, going up to this image right here, the pons highlighted in the kind of green is adjacent to the cerebellum, and so it's just a way for nerve cells to travel up to the thalamus and then back down, right between the thalamus and the cerebellum. Another area of the brainstem is called the medulla oblongata. This is also a sensory relay area, and we have cranial nerves associated with it. But where we'll focus on the medulla oblongata is later in the, I guess in the 4th unit this semester. We'll look at how it regulates the cardiovascular system, regulating how strong and often the heart beats, and the same thing with the respiratory system, how often and how deep or shallow the breaths that you take are. So we'll certainly see the medulla oblongata again. Another structure that we've discussed in lab is the area of the brain called the cerebellum, and it's going to work. It has a lot of roles for our survival, but we'll look at it specifically in regulating, right, coordinating voluntary motor control. It also activates or monitors the things called proprioceptors. Proprioceptors or proprioception is a term that I had you guys look up for your worksheet that you would have turned in lab this week. And so you should recall the term. It's just how the body monitors its position. And so the way that the body knows if you're standing, sitting, laying, falling, tumbling, whatever the case may be, is it's monitoring muscles in the body using these things called proprioceptors. Right? So they're continuously monitoring how the body is and just trying to make sure you're going to stay balanced so you don't fall over. And so the cerebellum, since it's helping coordinate voluntary movement, it's definitely got to work with that frontal lobe, which that primary motor area. Other important things that the cerebellum can do: pattern recognition out in the environment, like sequences of structures. And an example that always comes to my mind is, for example, the pattern of like yellow and black. If you see that in the environment, probably past experience tells you that it's probably a stinging, biting type of animal, right? So we can see sequences like that in the environment, or even just, for example, if you've ever seen a wheel on a car turn, and right, you predict the wheels would move forward, but because the way the wheels are turning, they actually look like they're turning backwards. Right? It's the cerebellum, the way it's predicting that you would expect the wheels to turn forward, and kind of visual optical illusion, if you will, but it's kind of messing with us in that case. But the patterns like that, for example, can be processed through the cerebellum. Language skills, problem solving, okay, all kinds of really cool things actually at some level processed through the cerebellum. I mentioned earlier I'd come back to this reticular formation, and I'll briefly talk about it. And this is an area that extends through the brainstem up through the thalamus, right? So, and just recall, the thalamus is the part of the brain that activates different lobes, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, whatever the case may be. And so the cells in the reticular formation are there to kind of keep us alert, awake, right, paying attention. And so the cells are collectively making up this thing called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. The reticular activating system cells are highlighted in this image in the pink. Okay, so you can kind of see how the cells in the pink extend through the brainstem. And then in the very middle, you can see the area of the thalamus, right? So the cells here in the reticular activating system then activate the cells of the thalamus, which then can activate, say, the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe or occipital or temporal lobe. A better way to kind of understand the reticular formation is how you can kind of stay alert and pay attention. So, for example, when you're sitting in class or even listening to this video, right, this presentation, which I'm certain is thrilling to sit and listen to, but you're able to sit there and pay attention and focus because the cells in the reticular activating system are activating the appropriate regions of the brain. What's interesting is the reticular activating system, if it's overactive, it's been linked to the disease called, or the condition called attention deficit disorder. And then conversely, if it's underactive, someone may actually be in a coma. And so the brain is understimulated. And so it's this reticular activating system that you need to kind of quiet down when you go to sleep. You know how if you go to sleep and you have trouble calming down and you're always thinking about different things or whatever the case may be. So the reticular activating system keeps activating the different regions of the brain. So we need to turn it down at night, but we don't want to turn it all the way off and go to a coma. As well as in the central nervous system, we have a set of cells or a group of cells that work together to form what's collectively called the limbic system. And you may have heard this term before, but basically it's a bunch of cells grouped together, including the cortex, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. It's a limbic system that gives you your emotional response and actually facilitates the learning procedure. And it helps dictate, or I guess pattern, your behavioral responses to society, right? Whether you're kind of overreactive or underreactive or whatever the case, however, whatever your emotional response is processed through the cells in the limbic system. The way that it works is by utilizing these, what's been defined as reward and punishment centers. And so when you experience something, whatever it is, you kind of categorize it as a good experience or a bad experience. And good experiences activate what's called the reward system, and something considered to be bad would activate the punishment center. And it utilizes those neurotransmitters that we've seen before called epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. Right, so the reward centers, for example, a scenario would be if you've got a crush right now with someone that you really like and you just think they're the bee's knees, right? Whenever you see that person or hear about that person, you're activating the reward center of your limbic system and then surge of neurotransmitters, and it makes you feel happy. Conversely, a punishment center, right? You may experience something and you feel kind of sad or down about the scenario, and it's operating through the limbic system. Figure 917 tries to illustrate in green some of the structures that help in this emotional limbic response. And look closely, you can kind of see something interesting. Your olfactory nerves, they help make up your limbic system. So If you ever had an emotional response to a smell, like you smell apple pie, it makes you think of Granny, right? Activates the limbic system, or we can kind of go on with scenarios. But so in other words, it's a bunch of cells in the brain that collectively regulate your emotional response to different scenarios. This will conclude the 9A presentation, and you will keep an eye out for the 9B presentation.